that's good. I'm not talking today about Irish writers and US magazines, which, as Elka says, is my main project at the moment. I'm talking about an Irish writer in an Irish periodical, so I've got a bit distracted by this work. It's about Edna O'Brien, who died last summer, and her very first published writings under the pseudonym Sabiola. So that's what I'll be talking about for about the next 40 minutes, and hopefully we'll have some time for questions and discussion. Okay, so on the 25th of April 1958, The Spectator devoted a section of its magazine to Ireland Today, featuring contributions by Brian Inglis, Kevin Nolan, Edna O'Brien and others, as well as 3 language poems in translation. The first page of the section featured just one advertisement. It was for Chorus Umper Air and CIE, the Republic of Ireland's public transport authority. Easily the best way to see Ireland, the advertisement proclaimed. It boasted of its coach tours, diesel trains, radio train day trips and great southern hotels, and directed interested readers to their local travel agent or to CIE's public relations department in Dublin. What the Spectator's readers almost certainly did not know at this point, and a little known fact even today, is that Edna O'Brien was from October 1950 to May 1953 herself employed by CIE's public relations department. During that time, she wrote a weekly column under the pseudonym Sabiola for 2 CIE publications, which featured many references to motor coach tours, radio trains and other offerings. It was to be 600 words in length, light-hearted and of interest to women, she recounts in her 2012 memoir, Country Girl. I would receive the exorbitant fee of a guinea. She used the pen name Sabiola, which she dimly recalled was the name of a concubine in the court of King Farouk of Egypt. Sabiola first appeared as the author of 3 columns published in CIE's Weekly News, which was the precursor to the link, which I'm going to talk mostly about today. The majority of O'Brien's columns appear, however, in the Weekly News' successor, The Link, a weekly tabloid newspaper for transport workers published by the CIE Public Relations Department between the 24th of November 1950 and the 29th of May 1953. The entire run is held at the Irish Railway Record Society archives at Heuston Station in Dublin. And I do want to thank Tim Moriarty, who's the librarian at the Irish Railway Record Society, for helping me to identify the link and for providing me with access to the full run of the newspaper in June last year. Out of 130 issues of the link, O'Brien's Sabiola column appeared in 123. At 600 words each, this amounts to a substantial body of work, almost 74,000 words in total. However, O'Brien is rather dismissive of writings in Country Girl. These nonsensical jottings, she notes wryly, were a long way from James. O'Brien asserted the importance of Joyce as a literary forebear throughout her career, often to disparage other writing by comparison, here her own. However, this paper takes seriously O'Brien's Sabiola columns, demonstrating that they provided her with a grounding in the literal, metaphorical and gendered significance of travel and transport, which became abiding preoccupations in her early fiction, particularly the Country Girls trilogy, so 1960 to 64. In my previous work on O'Brien, I identified the recurring motifs of the Blue Room and the Blue Road in her fiction. The first evocative of domesticity at home, the second of a kind of wanderlust that refers to both physical journeying and literary experimentation. The Blue Room symbolises alternately the restrictions or potentialities of a mother-identified home. The Blue Road signifies writerly, physical and psychic journeys that have taken the daughter away from or back to home. In this paper I expand this argument, demonstrating that the Sabiola apprenticeship equipped O'Brien with concrete knowledge of Irish transport and the metaphorical possibilities of the same. Modes of transport, walking, bicycles, trains, buses, cars and airplanes loom large in O'Brien's early fiction and are often bound up with the politics of place, gender and labour. Moreover, mobility is central to the Sabiola column itself, both thematically and formally. In it, O'Brien foregrounds her peregrinations in and beyond Dublin, adopting a kind of woman-about-town persona usually reserved for male writers of the period. At a formal level, the diffuseness of the column's topics perhaps reflects O'Brien's attempts to meet the assignment brief while simultaneously asserting her writerly self's prerogative to wander independently down more imaginative routes. So O'Brien's Sabiola columns have never previously been discussed. This is curious given that they were mentioned in Country Girl over 10 years ago, and a facsimile of one of the columns is even reproduced in the book. The lack of attention paid to this work is perhaps due to the emphasis O'Brien herself placed on the significance of the Country Girls and its composition away from Ireland, that's her first novel, The Country Girls 1960, as foundational moments in her career. When she migrated to London in November 1958, she found both freedom and the incentive to write her first novel, is what she says in her memoir. In interviews, O'Brien was vocal on the effect migrating to London had on her writing, adopting the Joycean position that creative autonomy can only be achieved by leaving Ireland. I never wrote a line in Ireland, she told Mary Marr in 1967, technically false since she had written at least 74,000 words of the Sabiola column. I wrote The Country Girls in the first 3 weeks after I left Ireland, torn in grief, despair and anger, she continued. You have to go if you find your roots too threatening, too impinging, she claimed in a 1984 interview with Philip Roth. Joyce said that Ireland is the sow that eats its farrow. He was referring to their attitude to their writers. They savaged them. It is no accident that our two greatest illustrati, himself and Mr. Beckett, left and stayed away, though they never lost their particular Irish consciousness. In my own case, I do not think that I would have written anything if I had stayed. She quoted the same Joyce line in an interview with Ken Adachi in 1988, and it also appears in Country Girl, when O'Brien describes a Limerick gathering in which locals assembled to castigate her after the publication of her first 2 novels. However, O'Brien had been publishing non-fiction, fiction and poetry for at least 8 years before she migrated to London in 1958. By her own admission in Country Girl, the Sabiola columns are her very first publications. An analysis of these works thus enables us to complicate productively her own pronouncements on the Joycean model of creative exile. Beyond O'Brien's oeuvre, her work for The Link confirms the significant role that newspapers played in fostering and showcasing Irish writing of the mid-20th century. Brian Friel, Patrick Kavanagh, Benedict Kiley, Maura Lafferty, Brian O'Nolan and others produced substantial bodies of work for Irish newspapers, a phenomenon which is beginning to receive overdue attention. And we can now add O'Brien to that list. There are several reasons for the prior neglect of this work, among them the unavailability until fairly recently of digitised archives of Irish newspapers and the ambivalence of the writers themselves regarding their journalism and other work they undertook for newspapers during the 1940s and 50s. The latter has its roots in the complex legacies of high modernism in the late modernist moment. As John Brannigan observes in an essay on Brendan Behan's Irish Press columns 1951 to 56, disdain for newspapers among modernist writers such as Pound, D.H. Lawrence, T.S. Eliot, Woolf and others was not just about commercialism, but was indicative of animosity towards the so-called masses, towards democracy and towards the rise of a general reading public. Thus, in a 1957 article lamenting the state of Irish letters and the absence of obvious successors to Joyce and George Bernard Shaw, Friel noted the persistence of the small men, and plenty of them, the journalists and writer-teachers and writer-barristers and writer-civil servants who plodded on, but their creative talent became gnarled with rage and vexation. In Brian Moore's An Answer from Limbo, 1962, when aspiring writer Brendan Tierney bemoans the hack writing job he has at a magazine while trying to finish his novel, we may detect Moore's own ambivalence about having begun his writing career at the Montreal Gazette in the late 1940s. When O'Brien claims that her Sabiola columns were a long way from James Joyce then, her value judgment echoes that of Pound et al., though in fact Joyce himself engaged with newspapers, cinema and new media technologies. So the potential of the newspaper as a productive and, more importantly, legitimate writerly outlet is foregrounded in a suggestive scene from O'Brien's memoir, Travelogue, Mother Ireland from 1976. In it, O'Brien describes cycling to Finn's Hotel in Dublin, a site representing O'Brien's literary and familial ancestries, It is where Nora Barnacle worked when she was being courted by Joyce, and it's also where O'Brien's own parents had celebrated their wedding breakfast. However, O'Brien does not cross the threshold of Finn's hotel, but stood holding onto the bicycle, looking and waiting, certain that before the night was through something fateful would have happened. And indeed something fateful does happen. When she later stops off at a newspaper office, likely the Irish Press, and is invited to the pub by some of the newspaper men, she meets this fate. The Dublin landmark associated with Joyce gives way to the more quotidian and less obviously literary settings of a newspaper office and pub. After she is subsequently jilted by one of the newspaper men she met that night, a man she calls in various life writing Peter Abelard, O'Brien writes a poem. The poem is Shadows, and it was published in the Irish Press on the 15th of December 1952. So in other words, the newspaper office, and not an iconic Joycean site, is both the catalyst and outlet for O'Brien's nascent creative writing. So what follows in this paper is divided into three sections. The first sketches some contextual information about CIE, the link, and O'Brien's contributions to it. The second focuses on how O'Brien's apprenticeship at the link trained her to be alert to the literal and metaphorical possibilities of transport, particularly in relation to the question of migration that underwrites the Country Girls trilogy. And then the third, very short section considers the formal features of the Sabiola column as themselves exemplifying a form of imaginative mobility or wanderlust. So, CIE and the link. CIE came into being on the 1st of January 1945 under the Transport Act 1944, and it merged the Great Southern Railway, which had previously operated rail, bus and lorry services, and the Dublin United Tramway Company, which operated trams until 1949 when they were replaced by Dublin buses. It was hoped that it was a private company with shares traded on the Dublin Stock Exchange, and it was hoped that restructuring the railways would enable the company to generate income for capital investment. But CIE was beset with financial troubles from the outset, among them the costly maintenance of an ageing fleet of steam locomotives and the harsh winter of 1947, during which Britain stopped exporting coal, meaning CIE struggled to power its trains. And you can see from this cover story, an editorial from the link in 1951, that coal shortages continued into the 1950s. CIE was nationalised in June 1950. Its annual report from 1950-51 numbers the company's employees at 22,100, and the employees were represented by 29 different trade unions, so it was actually at the time Ireland's largest employer. Thus, the Link, a weekly newspaper for CIE employees, had a relatively large potential circulation, comparatively speaking, given this was an employee periodical. Its first issue, 24th of November 1950, featured a message from CIE chairman T.C. Courtney wishing the editor luck with the publication. He called upon every CIE man to become a regular reader and in this way cooperate with you in developing a spirit of unity and good fellowship in our organisation. Priced at 2p, the newspaper appeared every Friday. In the first issue of The Link, Sabiola echoed Courtney in expressing her hope that the flame of CIE's literary candle, The Link, will burn with a bright and warm glow, blazing across the counties to illuminate the dark rooms of many a faraway friend. For the first several months of the newspaper's existence, the Sabiola column was badged as a feature for our womenfolk. It is likely that at least until May 1951, Sabiola was the only female writer for The Link. In a May 1951 column, she seconded a correspondence call for more women contributors. After all, why should Sabiola be left alone to combat the glib javelins of facile male pens, she wrote. From around June 1951, however, the woman-facing content was expanded to an entire page, sometimes explicitly headed mainly for women. The page, which ran frequently but not every week, typically featured some combination of the following: a column showcasing the professional or leisure activities of CIE's female employees, a writer using the byline Shandon Bells, reporting from CIE offices at Dublin's North Wall, where many of the organisation's female employees were based, engagement and wedding news, reports from CIE social events, recipes, Uncle Tony, a column for children, and Sabiola. As such, the newspaper followed in the footsteps of its regional and national counterparts, some of which featured dedicated columns directed at female readers from as early as the 1920s. In the post-World War II period, such content proliferated, with especially for women appearing in the Irish Independent, an Irish Woman's Diary in the Irish Times, and the feminine angle in the Kerryman. The Irish press did not have an official woman's page, but it employed Moira Comerford as woman's editor from 1936 to 65, and it carried regular columns directed at women, including from 1951 by Edna O'Brien. As Bernadette Whelan notes, the columns provided space to direct advertisements at women and also counsel on standards of living against which the reader's own lifestyle could be measured. The Link departed from its regional and national counterparts in that advertising was not a major feature of the newspaper. It printed occasional advertisements for cheese, oil, insurance companies, etc. But as a publication presumably funded through CIE's staffing budget and its own sales, it did not rely on advertising income. It's impossible to summarise O'Brien's 123 columns for the Link. However, there are three significant threads. First, a focus on the consumption of goods and services assumed to be of interest to women: hairstyles, cosmetics, fashion, flowers, food. Second, an emphasis on Dublin's cultural life, including the theatre, the ballet, concerts and exhibitions. Third, promotion of CIE's portfolio of activities, particularly leisure travel. The Link featured widespread coverage of Irish tourism initiatives, especially those for which CIE was itself responsible or in which it was centrally involved, among them radio trains, coach tours on postal, and a promotional film titled Ireland, Land of Welcome. Sabiola integrated allusions to much of this material in her columns, thus ensuring that the business of CIE was echoed and reinforced even in its more light-hearted fare. The Sabiola columns were in that sense very much on message. Nonetheless, O'Brien smuggles into columns about leisure travel and tourism allusions to what we might consider its antithesis in mid-20th century Ireland: travel out of Ireland undertaken for seasonal or permanent migration. Leisure travel implies gainful employment as the norm. Being propelled to migrate suggests the opposite. One example is Sabiola's column of the 10th of August 1951, describing a trip to Killaloe, County Clare, with which O'Brien was clearly very familiar, having grown up about 8 miles away in Tuamgraney. Sabiola notes that the local hotel is alive with American, Scotch and city accents. However, as she and her companions leave the town, she thinks the pity it is that Killaloe should be such a ghost. Its one factory, the box factory, is the only pulse of industry in the town, and Ballyvalley, a few miles outside, could easily be renamed the desolate Tirnanogue. While migration remains unmentioned here, the language of ghosts and desolation resonates with many other depictions of rural Irish towns and villages at mid-century. An article published about a month later is more explicit. In August 1951, CIE assumed responsibility for the Galway Aran Islands steamboat service operated via the SS Dúnaingeas. Soon afterwards, O'Brien duly wrote a column in the Link describing her own experience sailing aboard the Dúnaingeas. Throughout, she notes the crossing's appeal to tourists. A German boy with an elaborate camera takes snapshots of the Clare Hills over to the left. An English woman praises the tea served in the cabin. But Sabiola also witnesses an Irish migrant returning for a visit after an absence of 5 years. In that moment, I saw 100 young women and an army of strong men go out of Aran, and my mind did not show them coming home, because to Aran there is no comeback. Once you leave, you stay away. Voluntary exile, you'd call it maybe. Even in articles ostensibly promoting a key pillar of Ireland's tourist infrastructure, transport, Sabiola's columns articulate a tension between Ireland's appeal to tourists versus how it has failed its own sons and daughters, a tension O'Brien subsequently reiterates in Mother Ireland. People fall in love with Ireland, she writes in that work. Tourists go there and are smitten with the white cottages nestling, so to speak, beneath the hills, the the ranges of brooding Blue Mountain, the haze above them, the fuchsia hedges in Kerry, etc., etc. However, there must be something catastrophic, she continues, about a country from which so many people go, escape. So I'm moving on to the next section now, which takes on more directly, I suppose, this link between the Sabiola columns, transport and migration. It is significant that one of Sabiola's musings on immigration refers to sea travel, because in Irish literature of the mid-20th century, the iconic form of transport is arguably the night boat or boat train, particularly to Euston Station in London. This is unsurprising given that the 1956 census recorded the lowest population, about 2.8 million, since the inception of the state. Over 200,000 Irish citizens emigrated during the 5-year period from 1951 to 56. The migrants' departure from Ireland for Britain by boat recurs in works such as Moore's An Answer from Limbo, John McGahern's The Barracks, John B. Keane's Self-Portrait, and of course O'Brien's fiction. So we have, for example, in Brian Moore's An Answer from Limbo, Brendan Tierney leaving Belfast, the night boat's hooter echoed up the loch, fog closed in, old hands had bagged the benches, the rest of us sat on our suitcases. Bottles of stout went around and a pale girl in black, home for a death in the family, sang in a choir loft contralto, Tuaran Mavorni Mavorni. The last channel boy slipped past the porthole, Ireland invisible at sea. And in McGahern's The Barracks, Elizabeth is taking a train journey to Dublin many years after she used to take the train to Dublin to take the night boat on to London. The lights of this city, Dublin, used to glow in the night when the little boat train taking Elizabeth back to London after Christmas came in and out of the countryside and winter dark. The putting on of overcoats and the taking of cases off the racks and the scramble across the platform to get on the train that went the last 8 miles out of the boat. Always girls weeping, as she had wept the first time too. Hard to know you cannot hide forever in the womb and the home. You have to get out to face the world. The iconic status of the boat train lives on in paintings. The iconic status of the boat train lives on in paintings such as Approaching Euston, 2003, and Holyhead Euston by Bernard Canavan, and in, for example, works such as Joseph O'Connor's Cowboys and Indians, 1991. In O'Brien's fiction, it surfaces most notably in the mirrored endings of The Country Girls, 1960, and The Girl with Green Eyes, 1962. In the first novel, Kathleen Brady vainly hopes to take a trip to Vienna with her older married suitor, Mr. Gentleman. In the second, she vainly hopes the lover from whom she has recently split, Eugene Gaillard, will turn up at the port to stop her from migrating to England with her friend, Baba. While the first unrealised departure is by airplane and the second actual departure is by night boat, the obvious reversal O'Brien performs on Joyce's Eveline confirms that the airplane of The Country Girls should also properly be considered a night boat. After all, Joyce's protagonist, Eveline, was to go away with Frank by the night boat to be his wife and to live with him in Buenos Aires, where he had a home waiting for her. But at the North Wall, Eveline's courage deserts her and she fails to board the ship with Frank. Like Moore, O'Brien emphasises the poignancy of departure and passengers drinking and singing their way through their emotions. Koch, in The Girl with Green Eyes, can hardly believe that we were moving, that we were leaving Ireland. And through my tears I saw our friends waving us away, and cranes and anchored ships and the long uninspiring stretch of quay which we rode past. Down below, the people travelling third class carried their drinks outside and they leaned on the rails and sang. In Mother Ireland, O'Brien writes of her own departure for London in November 1958. I took the mail boat like most others, sat up all night, watched the drinking, the spilling, walked the deck. In O'Brien's memoirs, her final destination is a London train station. It's alternately Euston and Waterloo. So in Mother Ireland, the final destination is Euston, described as a jungle, grim and impersonal. The very pigeons looked man-made. But in a 1984 interview and in Country Girl, O'Brien describes arriving instead at Waterloo station. So in 1984, she said, I'd never been outside Ireland. and it was November when I arrived in England. I found everything so different, so alien. Waterloo Station was full of people who were nameless, faceless. There were wreaths on the cenotaph for Remembrance Sunday, and I felt bewildered and lost, an outsider. And in 2012, she recalls finding Waterloo so grimy and sooted, the waddle of the pigeons so ungainly, not supple like birds at home. It was November, and seeing the wreaths of paper poppies around the several monuments as we went in a taxi from Waterloo Station to SW20, I thought England was so dolorous. So while London stations loom large in the Irish imagination in the mid-20th century, including in O'Brien's work, her Sabiola columns help us to understand the perhaps under-recognised significance of the Irish railway to migration journeys both within and beyond Ireland. The railway was invariably how migrants reached Dublin, whether that was their final destination or a mere stop on the way to London or elsewhere. As such, rural train stations in Ireland carry just as much meaning as urban British ones. In Self-Portrait, 1964, John B. Keane writes of his departure, he was going to, his final destination was Northampton in England, in January 1952. When I boarded the train at Listowel that morning, it seemed as if everyone was leaving. It was the same at every railway station along the way. In the barracks, Elizabeth's memories of returning to London via the boat train are precipitated by a journey from rural Ireland to Dublin for a medical appointment. Her husband reflects that they are lucky they didn't take the 3:25 train. It's like a cattle train these days, and them all for the night boat. Tom Murphy, a near contemporary of all these writers, McGahern, O'Brien and John B. Keane, recalls, I think the most important feature of my growing up was the emigration from the family. Somebody always seemed to be arriving or going away. A lot of emotion centred around the little railway station in my hometown of Tuam. So while rates of migration from Ireland during the 1950s are startling, the demographic shift from rural to urban Ireland was also dramatic. As Patrick Fitzgerald and Brian Lamkin note, despite limited industrial development and against the overall trend of population decline, the population of Dublin almost doubled between 1901 and 1951. Between 1926 and 1951, the proportion of the population of the state living in Greater Dublin increased from under 15 to over 20%. And of course, O'Brien herself was part of this rural to urban migration. She migrated to Dublin in 1948, and then she migrates to London in 1958. So she had 10 years in Dublin before she migrated to London. In the Sabiola columns, we can perceive the roots of O'Brien's powerful treatment of internal migration in her first two novels, the literal vehicle for which was invariably CIE's rail network. In The Country Girls and The Girl with Green Eyes, the depiction of rural to urban migration oscillates between the celebratory and the melancholy. It is underwritten by a tension between faith in the liberatory potential of the city, particularly perhaps for women, and a suspicion that such faith is misplaced. That, as Claire Wills puts it, there's ultimately no difference between urban and rural when it comes to the female economy. In the Sabiola columns, we can identify traces of these tensions that are more fully thought through in the Country Girls trilogy. In her column of the 15th of August 1952, for example, Sabiola recounts a recent stop she made at the railway station in Bird Hill, County Tipperary. Life began in earnest the day I first took a train from Bird Hill to Dublin, she recalls. Yet nostalgia sends her back there to look for the little machine out of which came 1 shilling chocolate bars long ago in Bird Hill. It wasn't there. In her very first column for The Link, Sabiola writes that although Dublin is a haven for many, sometimes the warmth of an electric fire wafts us back to a glowing hearth fire in a whitewashed kitchen. Never, I suppose, will the red brick and railings of Phibsborough or Rathmines win our hearts from the twisted bogreens and creaking gates. That means home. In another column about a bus journey, Sabiola describes how a mere transport vehicle is transformed into the village social by virtue of it leaving the city and entering the countryside. Upholding truisms that the city is cold and anonymous and the country warm and friendly, she writes that the bus that rattles into the village terminus has a more cheery sound than the vehicle that steered its way past the city streets an hour or two ago. In another piece, she recalls an elderly Clare man telling her, as they stood on O'Connell Bridge gazing at the serried rows of lights and the stream of buses and taxis, "Dublin is a monument to man's ingenuity, indeed, but the hills and the bogs and the rushes of rural Ireland are a monument to God." Such instances of nostalgia are, however, far outweighed by the energy and distractions of urban living catalogued in the Sabiola columns at large. In The Country Girls, Cauch is enchanted by the neon fairyland of Dublin, which she professes to love more than I had ever loved a summer's day in a hayfield. Lights, faces, traffic, the enormous vitality of people hurrying to somewhere. This is the place she wants to be. Forevermore, I would be restless for crowds and lights and noise. I had gone from the sad noises, the lonely pelting on the galvanised roof of the chicken house, the moans of a cow in the night when her calf was being born under a tree. At other moments, however, Cauch is nostalgic for what she left behind. Of her home place, she recalls, at the far edge of the lake there was a belt of poplar trees shutting out the world I wanted to escape to. And now that I had come into the world, that scene of bogs and those country faces were uppermost in my thoughts. Ultimately, the ambivalence with which rural-urban migration is rendered in The Country Girls and The Girl with Green Eyes owes itself to O'Brien's scepticism about what the city's supposed modernity versus the country's comparative backwardness might offer Irish women, a question that has vexed many Irish feminists. When it comes to interpreting the history of Irish modernisation, Patricia Coughlin warns, it would be misleading to accept a simple before and after narrative of enlightenment or to posit a completely clear liberal, conservative and urban rural divide in Ireland, especially where questions of women's status and freedoms are concerned. O'Brien makes this apparent by investing rail travel, a powerful symbol of modernity, with significations that alternate between liberation and incarceration. I refer here to two scenes that take place on trains in the first two novels, The Country Girls and The Girl with Green Eyes. In The Country Girls, Kate and Baba migrate from rural Ireland to Dublin by train. The train is a permissive space where the girls can smoke and drink, anticipating the freedom and autonomy that they hope await them in Dublin. Seeking out the smoking carriage, the girls went down the corridor giggling and giving strangers the so what look. Kate reflects, I suppose it was then we began that phase of our lives as the giddy country girls brazening the big city. People looked at us and looked away again as though they had just discovered that we were naked or something. But we didn't care. We were young and we thought pretty. In The Girl with Green Eyes, after Cauch's father receives an anonymous letter informing him of his daughter's dalliance with a married man, he travels to Dublin and compels her to return home with him. On the train, she considers various possible means of escape, whether I'd get off at the first stop or pull the emergency cord when he wasn't looking and jump off, or whether she can hide in a lavatory and get off at the next stop. On the journey, she is infantilized by both her father and an acquaintance he bumps into on the train, her father referring to her as his youngster and the friend accompanying her to the train lavatory, making escape impossible. In the first scene, Kate and Baba have the freedom to get a little tipsy as we swayed on the high stools in the train's bar. In the second, it is Kate's father who gets quite drunk and starts swaying on the high stool. Despite him falling asleep due to drunkenness, the courage Kate needs to pull the emergency cord fails her, and she is duly returned to her home place. So the girl, this is moving on to the final, quite brief section and conclusion at this point. So The Girl with Green Eyes ultimately foregrounds the limits of Irish women's mobility aboard CIA trains. Sabiola's columns are more circumspect, though a gentle rebuke is nonetheless perceptible. First, they suggest a connection between observational power, masculinity and bus conducting, a profession from which Irish women were excluded. Second, for all their endorsement of CIE transport, the columns ultimately impress upon the reader the significance of walking as an enactment of female power. On the 4th of January 1952, Sabiola concludes her column by noting that year by year, women come more and more into their own. Wouldn't it be queer if they were made bus conductors? It is a telling rhetorical question, partly because of the challenge it poses to CIE to extend equal opportunities to its female employees. CIE's first female conductors were employed on Cork City buses in July 1979, so 27 years later. It is also noteworthy because of the link Sabiola earlier makes between bus conducting and the form of observation in which she engages or aspires to engage as a writer. In a particularly revealing column, Sabiola considers the profession that makes men most observant. She weighs up the talents of a school teacher, a policeman and an editor, and concludes that each has a limited perspective compared to a bus conductor. His was the mind of the microscope. His eye was the camera, eyeing people as they came and went to business, pictures or seaside. A bus conductor sees everything. Given this, it's significant that in October 1952, Sabiola reports a dance partner telling her that if 'twas in England you were, you'd be a bus conductor. He tells her she has the cut of one, and in an apparently casual reference in Girls and Their Married Bliss, Kate mentions the lady conductor who takes her fare when she boards a bus in London. Bus conducting may have afforded a privileged view of urban life, but of course it is not a career that is open to women in Ireland in the 1950s. Instead, Sabiola exercises her observational power by walking and by reporting what she sees. The Phoenix Park is like a sea of verbose humanity, she writes on the 9th of March 1951. There, an elderly bewhiskered gentleman strolls through the people's gardens. A young woman in shabby slacks and a drab raincoat shuns the crowds. She's an artist, and that's a law student with the great beard, and that man in the purple coat is a well-known actor. The park has its regulars and its casuals. The healthy lassies with camogie sticks chase to the sports grounds like greyhounds, and there are children everywhere, climbing railings in spite of the bylaws, crouching behind trees or drinking water from the fountains. Sabiola visits a photography exhibition at the College of Art. She muses on the romance of objects she finds in a Dublin antique shop. She recounts what she overhears teenage girls saying while she's standing at a bus stop. On the 16th of February 1951, it is her superior powers of observation that enable her to be moved by a busker singing on Grafton Street when her fellow pedestrians are too busy or preoccupied to take note. Smart women intent on matters that only they can imagine walked by with unseeing eye. Clubland was not far away, and for that reason men hurried past without a side glance. O'Brien's peregrinations on foot might be read not only as a critique of CIE's exclusion of women from certain roles, they also resonate with Patrick Kavanagh's City commentary in the Irish press, which appeared from September 1942 to February 1944 and were written under the pseudonym Piers Plowman. As his biographer, Antoinette Quinn, explains, Kavanagh played the role of roving reporter, indulging his lively curiosity about all aspects of his surroundings: street traders, other pedestrians, children at play, and the contents of stalls, book barrows, shop windows. He appreciated the banter of more street traders, eavesdropped on women in a cafe, chatted to a street photographer, to a jeweller in a shop, and to a gardener in the Botanic Gardens. He was a carefree man about town. Every so often, however, his misogynist or deeply conservative views on women are voiced, according to Quinn. Indeed, he writes about the pianist Rona Coghill as one of the women exceptions that proves the rule of my prejudice that women are lacking in the technical and interpretive qualities for great art. While O'Brien did not enjoy Kavanagh's platform in a national newspaper, her Sabiola columns are an important corrective to the gendered assumptions of both CIE and O'Brien's male writer contemporaries. That Sabiola's wanderings around Dublin were considered a form of gender transgression is clear from her response to a letter to the editor that had criticised her unhomeliness. She reported the rebuke as follows: "With all your fashion parades and all your shopping, 'tis a wonder but you went to the Ideal Homes exhibition." However, other readers appreciated the heterogeneity of Sabiola's columns. One Dublin correspondent to the link, One Dublin correspondent to the link, calling herself Candid, wrote on the 9th of March 1951, "I like the way Sabiola switches with such ease and versatility from such trifling subjects as buttons and diaries to the analogous subject of youth and age. She is dynamic, light, yet serious. I think it would rob her of her glory, were she to confine herself solely to fashion, hairstyles, beauty treatment, etc.? Are we females not sufficiently catered for in this line by the weekly women's magazines? I suggest we let Sabiola go about her diverse ways and paths and bring into those little appetisers and mental cookies necessary, and not let that very prevalent fashionitis sweep us off our feet completely. I wanted to end with this because it strikes me that Candid is one of O'Brien's earliest and actually most insightful critics. She recognises that apparently trifling subject matter does not equate to a lack of seriousness on the part of the writing or the written matter. Moreover, she identifies in Sabiola's diverse ways and paths the significance of both physical journeying and literary experimentation that would subsequently become hallmarks of O'Brien's formidable body of work. Thank you.